information lavished upon us already today by Professor Sterner and Christiansen that I think that my talk now will be slightly shorter than the ones we've had so far. So if everything goes well, you'll have a longer coffee break in a moment. On the other hand, there's also a kind of difficulty here that I should mention, because the talk that I gave this morning was very practical, and it showed you ways of describing things, of describing historical evolutions in language. This talk is much more abstract, and there are even some fairly philosophical references in there. So be prepared. Put on your seatbelts and try to follow me. So we are still within the semasiological variation part of the lectures. The material that I'm presenting now refers to a paper that I published in the volume edited by Gitte Christiansen and René Dirven, a volume that has already been mentioned a number of times, the Cognitive Sociolinguistics volume. And the questions that the paper addresses are the following. If we accept the importance of a social perspective for the study of semasiological variation, what are the forces that determine those social aspects of meaning, and do we have any theoretical models that describe the relations among those forces? And you'll see in a moment what I mean by these forces. So the steps I want to take are the following. First, I want to talk about Bill Clinton as a semantician. Okay, wait. You'll see. Then there's this philosophical part about the theory on the division of semantic labor, which was developed by the philosopher Hilary Putnam. And I will evaluate that theory and argue that we need some expansion, extension of it, some alternatives to the theory. And then we'll get to a final picture of what I just mentioned, that's forces and the relations within language. But first, Bill Clinton. Okay, well, a few more introductory steps maybe. In the previous talks, we've talked about semasiological variability of meaning. Let's first rehearse why we can say that social factors play a crucial background role in the variability. Well, I would say there are three reasons. In the first place, this is also something that came up in one of the questions this morning. There is an inherent flexibility in meaning. But why would we use that flexibility? Why would we extend the range of application of a category at all? Our cognitive abilities allow us to do that. We have mechanisms like similarity, metaphor, metonymy, and obviously blending. But why would we use those mechanisms at all? Well, that's because we want to be communicative in a certain sense. We want to communicate something. We want to categorize and communicate our categorization. So the ultimate functional motivations for exploiting the inherent flexibility of meaning are probably to a large extent social in nature. And we've seen very, very low-level examples of that when we looked at legging, where we could say that semantic variability ties in with the success of a certain garment as part of the current fashion. So that's one first reason why we can say that behind the flexibility that we have been describing, there are social mechanisms. A second reason why we can think of semantic variability as socially structured is that so far we've been working with an idealization. And it was also mentioned in Professor Christiansen's talk that we need to go to realistic levels, and we want to avoid too much idealization in talking about homogeneous languages or homogeneous linguistic communities. Now, if you think about what I did this morning and what I did yesterday with the prototype-based categories, you could maybe raise an objection. You could say, well, okay, you've described the structure with the core areas and the extensions, but how do you know that all those different meanings or applications are known to all the speakers of the language? Well, I don't. And one of the things that we should really investigate is to what extent various portions of the semantic range of application of a category are shared by different groups of speakers, or are not shared by different groups of speakers. So one thing, and that's where prototype models also get, or at least suggest, a sociolinguistic model. One thing you can imagine is that the core, the central applications, would certainly have a wider social distribution than the peripheral ones. The peripheral applications might, for instance, be technically specialized and would then only be known to technical specialists, or would be restricted to in another lectal way. But the central applications of the category would probably be known to all speakers, or to all mature speakers of a language. So that's another reason why we can think of variability as having a social background. The variability is, or the variation is not shared by all speakers of all members of a linguistic community. And that's where Bill Clinton will come in, one more reason to think about semantic flexibility and semantic variability as having a social structure and a social background is that semasiological variation is open to explicit social negotiation. That is to say, to put it more simply, there may be a social fight over meaning. People may debate whether a certain term is applicable or not. And that's what happened to Bill Clinton, and that was what was very nicely illustrated by Bill Clinton when he had to testify about his sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. You will remember the story, right? And so the question that was put to him was whether he had had sexual relations with Miss Lewinsky. And what I'm going to do now is to read or to present a number of excerpts from Clinton's testimony. And what you will see there, so what you have to focus on, is that what Clinton will be doing in his reply to the judge's question is not to exploit the flexibility of categories by extending a category, by stretching it to new cases, but he's doing precisely the opposite. He's trying to restrict the category to its core reading and implicitly denying the other aspects of the category. So at one point, Clinton says, I thought the definition, so the definition of sexual relation, that's what this is about. I thought the definition included any activity by the person being deposed where the person was the actor and came in contact with those parts of the bodies with the purpose of intent or gratification. Okay, this is legal language in a sense. And excluded any other activity. For example, kissing is not covered by that, I don't think. Okay. So his reasoning is sexual relation, that's only valid when you talk about intercourse, when you sleep with someone. And kissing is not part of a sexual relation. Okay? That's his reasoning. And then the judge asks, did you understand the definition to be limited to sexual activity? And even, well, okay, you could say here, okay, sexual activity, but then what is sexual activity? Okay? But Clinton said, yes, I understood the definition to be limited to physical contact with those areas of the bodies with a specific intent to arouse or gratify. And I believe at the time that she, so that's Lewinsky, that she filled out this affidavit if she believed that the definition of sexual relationship was two people having intercourse, then this is accurate. That's the definition of sexual relation. And I believe that that is the definition that most ordinary Americans would give it. If you said Jane and Harry have a sexual relation, and you're not talking about people being drawn into a lawsuit, etc., but you're just talking about people in ordinary conversation, I'll bet the grand jurors, if they were talking about two people they know, and they say they have a sexual relation, they mean they were sleeping together. They meant they were having intercourse together. So what is he doing here? What is his semantic strategy to deny that he had a sexual relation with Lewinsky? Well, his semantic strategy is to restrict the category to a core reading. You could indeed argue, I think, that when you talk about, when you would do this as a semantician, as a linguist, you could say, well, probably somewhere in the central reading, the central application of a term like sexual relation, yes, having intercourse is part of the central reading. But as linguists, we would at the same time say, okay, and then you have the more peripheral, less central readings where that aspect does not necessarily have to be present. So Clinton here, working as some kind of semantician, is in a sense restricting the category. We've so far seen examples where we expand the category and where we can see that in the course of time these natural language categories tend to attract more meanings and tend to be used flexibly. Clinton now shows us that it can also work the other way around. Actually, we see two things. We see both that categories can be envisaged only from their central reading, and specifically we also see that that has a social function, or that can have a social function. What we have here is a social debate about restricting rather than expanding the semasiological range of a concept rather. So the theoretical question I want to address now is, given that this is the case, what models do we have to deal with these aspects of variability? So remember that in the beginning of this talk I mentioned the term forces. So at this point you can also think about those forces as going in two directions. You have an expansive force and you have a restrictive force. Probably in most cases the expansive force would be the most important one, but in a number of cases like this one, there would be a restrictive force. So if we try to be more generic about that, if we try to be more theoretical about that, what is the basis of those forces? What actually decides, if you wish, in which direction things will go? And what have people been saying about that? What kind of general models do we have to talk about these two opposing tendencies in language? Restrictive tendencies versus expansive tendencies. Okay. Now that's where I want to take a good look at Hilary Putnam's principle of the division of linguistic labor. Notice that by the very labeling of the theory, well, it's part of a theory, as you will see. By the very labeling of the theory, division of linguistic labor, we get a social perspective. Right? This is about the distribution of meanings in a society. And that's what we should have when we think about the social background of semasiology. We should have something like a theory about the distribution of meaning in societies and about the forces that influence that distribution. So in order to get at the linguistic labor thing and the division of linguistic labor, I need to take a few steps, and I need to introduce you to some of the more philosophical aspects of Putnam's approach, an approach that he wrote down in a famous article called The Meaning of Meaning. And the approach, in fact, consists of two parts, the theory of rigid designation and then the linguistic division of labor. But in order to explain about the linguistic division of labor, we have to go through this thing about rigid designation first. We also have other labels for the two parts of the theory. The rigid designation part is also known as semantic externalism. And the division of labor part is also known as semantic deference. Okay, let's see rigid designation. And this is the philosophical part, because this is about the question, what is meaning and where do we find meaning? And Putnam's approach is rather, we could say, uncognitive. Because his idea is that meanings are not in the head. And as cognitive linguists, we would probably think of meanings as being at least partly in the head. We'll have to come back to that. But superficially speaking, this seems to be very uncognitive. So we'll have to explore this and see to what extent there is possibly an incompatibility between the two approaches. Now, what does it mean that meanings are not in the head? Well, Putnam illustrates this with his so-called twin Earth thought experiment. Okay, now try to follow this, because this is really philosophical reasoning, right? This is the reasoning of an analytical philosopher. Let's imagine that next to our own Earth, there is a twin Earth. Somewhere in the cosmos. Could be anywhere, but it's there. And we happen to know what it looks like. And it looks very much like our own Earth. The twin Earth resembles real Earth in all respects, except for the fact that what we call water here is represented on twin Earth, or corresponds on twin Earth, by a liquid that superficially has the same appearance and the same properties as earthly water. But if you look at it chemically, its composition is different from what we have here. Its composition is not H2O, but it's rather an imaginary XYZ. Okay? So everything's the same. All trees look the same. All people look the same. The history of the planets is the same, of twin Earth is the same. There's only one tiny difference. That's the H2O versus XYZ thing. Okay. Next step. Now imagine that twin Earth is visited by a human being, A, who is living around 1750. Yeah, how we can imagine that, that's another thing, but let's imagine that. In principle, we can imagine that. And in 1750, we didn't know yet that the chemical composition of water was H2O. So person A does not know that water, that the thing that he or she calls water, is H2O. The concept of chemistry in that sense is not yet known. So A is unaware of the fact that one molecule of earthly water consists of two molecules of hydrogen and one molecule of oxygen. And in analogous circumstances, because it's really twin-like, a native B of twin Earth visits our Earth, the earthly Earth, and B is similarly totally unaware that his own water is XYZ and that earthly water is H2O. Right. You're still following. Now, consider the idea that meaning is something cognitive in the head, that it is a concept, a psychological concept. Then we have a problem, because A and B have exactly the same cognitive state. Their psychological state about what they call water is exactly the same, because the only difference between earthly water and twin water is not known to them. So everything they know about water is exactly the same. Okay? Still, there is a difference in the reference of water, because we are also willing to say, so we're willing to accept that A and B are in the same psychological condition, but at the same time we accept that the referent of water, the extension of water, extension in the philosophical sense, that is what water refers to, that water refers to something else in English and in twin English. Okay? In English it refers to H2O, and in twin English it refers to XYZ. So, Putnam concludes, meanings are not in the head, because the two heads in this case are the same, but the meaning is different. Right? His argument is the meaning of water is different on Earth and on twin Earth, because the referent, the extensional reference is different, but the meanings in the head are, or the concepts in the head are the same. So, further step in his reasoning, meanings are not in the head, but they are determined by the hidden essence of things, like in this case the chemical composition. And there is a restriction here. He develops this theory specifically for natural categories, that is to say for categories that refer to natural kinds, right, to things in the world. Whether this would also apply to artifacts, so to the products of human activity, that's another question. We'll not really go into that very deeply. So originally it's developed for natural categories. So his theory is that natural categories rigidly designate things with a unique essence. Twin earth water is XYZ, earth water is H2O. And that settles the meaning, that determines the meaning of water in twin English and water in earth English. Okay. So that's where you get semantic externalism. It can't be in the head, Putnam argues, cannot be in the head, precisely because the two heads were the same in the thought experiment, but the things were different. The references were different. Okay, so that's rigid reference. Now, once we have that, we can add the part about the division of linguistic labor, because Putnam argues not all members of a linguistic community are required to know the hidden structure of the extension of an expression of their language. In our developed societies, we all know that water is H2O. But, well, when we're still children, we might not know that. It's something we have to learn. And there are many things, well, maybe even most other things, we don't know what the chemical composition is. We are more or less required to know what the composition of water is. We're supposed to know that it is H2O, but of many other substances, we're not supposed to know what the chemical composition is or what the hidden essence is. And that's what Putnam calls the division of linguistic labor. The division of linguistic labor implies that there are hidden essences, that's the rigid designation part, but we are not all obliged to know the hidden essences. We have specialists for that. We have, like, scientific experts who can tell us what the chemical composition of this or that type of matter is. So there is a division of linguistic labor that ensures that there are societal experts who know that water is H2O and who know many more things that laymen need not necessarily know. And laymen then, the non-experts, attune their linguistic knowledge, or their linguistic usage rather, to that of expert scientists and technicians. That means that if there is a debate about the true meaning of things, the true meaning being this reference to the hidden essence, if there is a debate about the true meaning, you will refer back to an expert. You will ask an expert, is this really the same thing as that? Okay. So that's the division of semantic labor. And there's another term that we have to introduce now, namely the term stereotype. Now notice to begin with, two terminological remarks to make here. Let me first explain what Putnam means by it, and then I'll make the remarks. A stereotype, so the fact that we don't need to know everything about those hidden essences does not exclude that there are requirements in a society about a minimum level of knowledge that we are supposed to possess, to acquire about concepts. So even, for instance, if we were not to know that water is H2O, we would still have to know other things. Why? Well, when can you say that you know the concept water? Knowing the concept water would necessarily imply knowing certain things. It would not necessarily imply knowing the chemical composition, but you would have to know other things. We would have to know that water is a colorless, transparent, tasteless, thirst-quenching liquid that boils at 100 degrees Celsius and that freezes, etc., etc. So we have to know a number of things. Okay? Putnam has other examples of this socially required minimum knowledge, and that's what he calls stereotypes. Like the stereotype of tiger would be something like a feline animal, yellowish with black stripes. Okay? That's the kind of knowledge he means. A socially determined minimum set of data with regard to the extension of a category. Now the terminological remarks. First, this looks very much like prototype. Stereotype, prototype. What's the distinction? We'll have to say a lot about that in a moment. Second remark, this is stereotype in a very specific sense. This is stereotype in the context of a philosophical theory of reference and meaning. It's not stereotype. It has a social aspect, but it's not stereotype in the sense of social stereotyping. Okay? Social stereotyping is when you have a certain image of a group of people. Right? The stereotype of Belgian people from the point of view of the Dutch people, from the point of view of people in the Netherlands, is that Belgians are sort of sloppy but joyous. Okay? That's a stereotype. And the stereotype of the Belgian people with regard to the Dutch people is somewhat different. I'm not going to go into that. But you know about that. That's social stereotyping, but that's not what we are talking about, even though we are talking here about stereotypes with a social aspect to them. Okay. Now, why is all of this interesting? I've been forcing you to follow through this Putnam-like argument. Why is it important? Well, think back of the Clinton question. In the Clinton example, you had a debate about meaning. Is the meaning of sexual relation restricted to intercourse or not? And in principle, if we could follow Putnam's approach, or if we could generalize that approach, we could possibly refer to expert knowledge. There might be an expert definition, or maybe a legal definition of what it is. So, superficially speaking, it would seem that Putnam's approach is an excellent starting point for a socio-semantic enrichment of prototype theory. As we've already said, stereotype and prototype seem to identify core semantic knowledge, water as a colorless, tasteless, etc. That would correspond somewhat to what we spontaneously think of as the prototype of the category water. And on top of that, stereotype would then be a social interpretation of prototype. Stereotype would be looking at prototype, at central prototype cases from a social point of view, what you would necessarily have to know about categories. Okay. So that looks good as a starting point for getting a grip on the social forces dealing with or determining semantic flexibility and restrictions on meaning. However, there are some major difficulties. We can't just do it in this way. Why not? Well, there are some aspects of stereotypes and prototypes where the two are clearly distinct. So let me mention the two most important ones. Semantic externalism, the idea that there is rigid designation to essences, to essential structures, that clashes with what is sometimes called the non-Aristotelian aspect of cognitive linguistics, the idea that our categorization is very flexible and that our categorization is not directly determined by the outside world, but is determined by our experiences, our cultures, our being as human beings, our activities as human beings, our functional needs, for instance, etc. So reducing meaning to some form of essence, and specifically an essence that is to be found in the outside world, that's not very cognitive. That's not very cognitivist. It goes against the insistence of cognitive linguistics on flexibility and human agency, in fact, on construal, on the fact that we categorize the world as, or that we construe the world by categorizing it. So that's a difficulty. There's a tension between the essentialist aspects of Putnam's theory and the focus on flexibility in cognitive linguistics. Then take another aspect, take semantic deference. The fact that in order to settle debates, you would go for the restrictive definitions that you can find in expert knowledge. That seems to clash with everything that we discussed this morning and in the second talk yesterday, where we saw how dynamic and expansive prototype-based theories, or concepts rather, actually are. So we have a tension there. Stereotypes and prototypes do not match as closely as it would seem at first sight. And if we can develop this a bit by having a closer look at the relationship between semantic externalism and semantic deference. So if we translate what I just explained in more schematic terms, we can say that in Putnam's stereotype theory, you get a combination of semantic externalism and semantic deference. And in prototype theory, you get exactly the opposite. You get a combination of absence of semantic externalism and absence of semantic deference. Once we've seen this, there's another question we can ask, and it will help us to move beyond Putnam. That's to what extent are semantic deference and semantic externalism logically dependent on each other? And if we take these two cases, stereotypicality and prototypicality, they seem to go together. Either you have both of them or you have neither of them. But even that is a simplification, because we can think of situations where you would have one and not the other in the two directions. So let me illustrate that with a few imaginary, we're doing philosophy, right? So we're using the same reasoning that Putnam would use. So let's think of a situation in which you have semantic externalism, but no semantic deference. Well, imagine an egalitarian society in which all members of the community have the same degree of schooling, maybe even the same degree of intelligence, who knows, and in which all attain the same level of proficiency in the sciences. You can imagine that. It's a logical possibility. And in such a community, a division of semantic labor would not be necessary, because all people would be schooled, and they would all know the hidden essences. They would all be aware of the current situation of science. So in that case, you would have semantic externalism. They would still refer to science as the expert judge to decide on hidden essences. But you would not need a division of semantic labor because they would all be scientists. Okay? So that's a logical situation, a logically possible situation in which you have semantic externalism and no semantic deference. Now, the other situation in which you have no semantic externalism, but in which you would have semantic deference. Well, imagine, in a sense, the opposite of what we had a moment ago, not an egalitarian society, but an old-fashioned theocratic society in which there is a caste of priests who not only watch over the holy shrine or of whatever god, or sets of gods or clusters of gods, but who at the same time observe a number of linguistic taboos. So let's assume that this is a society with an intricate system of linguistic taboo. And it would be the expert role of the priests to decide on the taboos. In that case, so the taboo items would be known to the community at large, but they would be known to the community at large by reference to the linguistic practices that are maintained and propagated by the caste of priests. And every once in a while, when something new would appear in the language or in the culture, the question would arise whether the new thing falls under one of the existing taboo categories. And who would be the judge? Who would decide? The priests would decide. So in that case, the semantic question, is this a taboo item or not, linguistically speaking, would be answered by semantic deference to the theocratic elite, but there would be no semantic externalism because science does not play a role here. It's not about hidden essences of things. The decisions the decisions about taboo might even be arbitrary. So we can easily imagine, in other words, situations in which semantic externalism and semantic deference are separated, where they do not occur together. So that means, if we come to that conclusion, if we see that semantic deference and semantic deference and semantic externalism do not necessarily occur together, we have a really empirical question. What factors actually determine their presence? What are the possibilities of, not the possibilities, what are the actual forces that determine whether a society has something like semantic deference, for instance? So that's one first major problem we have with Putnam. So I'm going back a few slides here. So that's the question about stereotypes versus prototypes. At first, they looked somewhat similar, somewhat superficially they looked similar, but they're certainly not. The underlying assumptions are different, so that means we have to look more closely into what actually happens. I want to mention another problem that you can have with Putnam, and that's a more direct indication of some difficulties that there are with his theory, some descriptive inadequacies. These have been pointed out fairly early already by a number of philosophers, and I'm referring here to Robert Ware as one of them. At the same time, I should mention that in philosophy, it's still a highly respected theory. Putnam's theory is still widely debated and accepted by a number of people. So it's not the case that these inadequacies have had a major effect on the major impact on the philosophical debate, but as linguists, we can see that there certainly are some difficulties with the linguistic parts of Putnam's theory. So let's have a look at a few arguments. One thing is, and that's also what you, well, maybe to some extent, what you could see in the Clinton example, to the extent that semantic deference plays a role at all, that is to say, to the extent that we refer to experts at all when we want to settle debates, the relevant experts are certainly not always scientists, and it's not always about hidden essences that we want to get expert knowledge. As I mentioned, Putnam's theory holds only for natural kind terms, but most of the words in the language do not involve natural kind terms. Still, they might be subject to semantic normativity effects, or you might try to impose a norm, as Clinton implicitly did. So, if we want to have a theory or a model of semantic normativity in language, we will have to go beyond Putnam, because Putnam only refers to one type of normativity, the scientific normativity, and that's not the only one. Second, to the extent, or the extent to which speakers rely on the experts, on the scientific experts, may be quite different according to the context, according to specific purposes and interests of the speakers. So, for instance, when you ask for a whiskey with ice, you don't ask for a whiskey with water, even though the experts, the chemical experts, will say that the hidden essence of water and ice is the same. Right? Ice is just a form of water, a condition in which water appears. But asking for a whiskey with ice is not asking for a whiskey with water. So depending on the circumstances, the norms do not always apply, if they apply at all. And third, there is the very simple fact, so a further fact to diminish the importance that Putnam seems to give to norms and to authority in language, semantic authority in language. There may obviously be conflicts among authorities. And as academics, we all know that. In a sense, we live on differences among authorities. That's why we have journals and debates and things like that. So the authorities, the scientific experts, certainly don't always agree. And that, again, somehow weakens the force of Putnam's theory or Putnam's model of semantic authority. So, where are we now? Well, we've seen that first. That was the first step we took. Given what Clinton did in the court, given what Clinton did, we need a model of normativity in language. Clinton seems to apply to a restrictive interpretation of a category as a normative kind of reasoning. This is what it really means. That's normative. Second, we then had a look at Putnam's theory of normativity in language, but we found that it was not totally convincing. There are some difficulties with it. At the same time, we do see that Putnam has an interesting idea that at least he acknowledges that in some cases people refer to experts to settle debates. Okay? So that's an interesting point that we might want to take along. Still, we need alternative models, and we would also like to see a model that not only says something about the restrictive tendencies, the tendencies to restrict meaning to a certain norm, but we would also like to see something that explains why we have the expansive tendencies. Again, I'm now going to refer to a philosophical theory about this, and that is Renate Bartsch's theory on norms of language. Renate Bartsch is a German-born philosopher who worked in Amsterdam. She's retired now. And what she stresses in her theory of norms is extremely interesting from the point of view of prototype theory, because it is a way of trying to explain why you can have semantic flexibility and still talk about norms. Because that's one of the difficulties, right, that we are facing. When we think about norms, we automatically think about norms as restricting the possibilities. So how can we have semantic norms? How can we even, or how can we include flexibility that we saw in our examples? How can we include that in a theory of norms? That's Bartsch's question. And so in her book, Norms of Language, she tries to solve the problem in the following way. She argues that semantic flexibility is not a breach of norms. It's not breaking the existing norms, as would almost automatically be the case if we believe Putnam, but is itself motivated by the normative aspects of language. Why? Well, we have a hierarchy of communicative norms in language. And this hierarchy of norms explicitly sanctions, allows for prototype-based deviations from established usage. In what way? Well, this is what Bartsch writes. All specific linguistic norms, specific in the sense that, for instance, using a word in a certain meaning, or giving a certain meaning to a word, that's a specific linguistic norm. Okay? So all specific linguistic norms are justified relative to the highest norm of communication, and that is, express yourself in such a way that what you say is recognizable and interpretable by your partner in agreement with what you intend him or her to understand. So, communicative efficiency is the highest semantic norm. And you can break lower level specific linguistic norms if that is important to achieve or to be in accordance with the highest linguistic norm. Correspondingly, for the hearer, the highest linguistic norm is interpret in such a way that the interpretation will be in agreement with what the speaker intends. There are, of course, some difficulties with this statement. As a hearer, you have to be in agreement with what the speaker intends. Well, obviously, how do you know what the speaker intends? That's where some philosophical difficulties might come in. Let's not go into those. What is important here is this hierarchy of norms which allows us to explain flexibility not as going against normativity, but as being part of normativity. That is to say, when we use a word with a new meaning, we break the given norms of a language. We stretch the norms of a language. We do something new that is not part of the convention. Okay? That's unnormative, going against the convention. At the same time, we can do so if we maintain the highest norm of communication. If we use a word flexibly with a new nuance, then we may do so precisely because it's communicatively relevant, because we want to talk about something that doesn't have a name yet, to put it very simply. When speakers are expressing new attitudes, when they are expressing evaluations, when they are expressing points of view, when they develop new scientific insights, when they communicate new technical developments, the new concept or the new context, it should rather be a new concept here, may not be easily communicated by remaining within the existing lower level norms. So you have to break the lower level norms on the basis of the communicative or motivated by the communicative efficiency that is expressed, that is embodied in Bartsch's higher level norm. So what we get here is a quite interesting theory that allows us to combine flexibility on the one hand and normativity on the other. Do we have our complete model yet at this point? Well, maybe not yet, because what we have now, if we take one step back and look with a bit of distance, we now have three kinds of socio-semantic forces or socio-semantic theories. First of all, in Bartsch's approach, you basically get a cooperative stance. Why? Well, it's like saying what speakers do is always to conform to the highest norm of communication. And that's working together. That's trying to express yourself as clearly as possible to the benefit of your interlocutor. And on the other hand, as a hearer, you try to understand the other person as explicitly as possible, as well as possible. So that's the semantics of cooperation. And that's what seems to underlie the unproblematic prototype-based expansions of meaning, which we've seen in our examples this morning and which are also described from a point of view of norm theory by Bartsch. So existing norms for linguistic behavior are stretched towards novel ways of using words, but the departure from the existing norms is socially acceptable. It's socially acceptable because it conforms to the highest norm of cooperation, of communication. That's being communicatively cooperative. But that's only one underlying model. There's another one, which is the Putnam model, where you have the semantics of authority. The semantics of authority comes into play when discussions and debates and debated issues are settled by deference to recognized experts. And these need maybe not always be scientific experts, as in Putnam's original theory of the division of linguistics labor, but the semantics of authority does exist. People do refer to experts and they do use that reference to expert, they do use the expert's opinion to settle debates on meaning. It's in the most the simplest case, simple. In some cases, linguists are invoked as experts. Linguists are indirectly invoked as experts when the question is, what does it mean? Let's look in the dictionary. Okay? That is a semantics of authority. We do have authorities on knowledge, a fortiori linguistic knowledge in society. So we do have, it seems that even apart from the semantics of cooperation, we do have a semantics of authority. So as opposed to the free cooperation, you have more restrictive forces at work. And then finally, we also have a semantics of conflict and competition. That is when semantic choices are implicitly, there's a typo there, when semantic choices are implicitly questioned or explicitly debated. And of course, such debates may be settled by invoking the semantics of authority, but they could even occur in the absence of a mutually accepted authority that could settle the discussion. So when I initially talked about or referred to forces that seem to shape the social dynamics of meaning, these are the things that I was anticipating on. I was anticipating on models where we could see a force of communicative cooperation, a force of referring to authorities, and a force of conflict and competition. And I think we can go one tiny step further when we try to see the relationship between those various forces. And I would first like to do that from a sociological point of view, because what you get here, if you think about these basic forces, you get something that you find at other levels or in other forms of the organization of society as well. What are the major types of social structure that we have? Well, basically, we have three basic types. We have competitive types of structures. Well, most of societies, well, most are not pure, but okay, in an idealized way. We have competitive structures, competitive societies, like capitalism. We have societies that are based on direct power relations, in more conservative and authoritarian societies, and we have societies that are based on institutionalized collaboration, what we would call socialist societies. So it would seem that the forces that play a role in the social dynamics of meaning are not really restricted to meaning. My suggestion would be that we find the same type of organizing forces in other aspects of society. But then, and that's the point which I would like to conclude, I would also claim that these underlying forces, and this was actually already implicit in the way I presented it, that these underlying forces may work either in a restrictive or in an expansive direction. Thinking about what they do to meaning, okay? Bartsch's approach is clearly expansive. It explains why we can get new meanings and why we have prototype structured flexibility that leads to expansion of categories. That's the result that's what comes out of applying her model of cooperative communication. Putnam's approach, on the other hand, would be rather restrictive, would lead to forces that contain the expansion by reference to authorities. So if we bring things together, we could say that maybe this is just a suggestion, and as I said, the whole talk is fairly abstract, but let's think of two dimensions. Let's think of a dimension on the one hand where you have the distinction between semantic expansion and semantic restriction. That's the vertical dimension. On the horizontal dimension, you would get the distinction between harmonious models and models that are conflictuous. Models that focus on discord, differences of opinion, and models that stress the possibility of harmonious solutions or harmonious cooperation. And if we then try to plot the three types of semantics that we mentioned, we get this picture. Semantics of conflict is obviously situated on the discord side, and it could go either way. When there is competition about meaning, it could be resolved in an expansive way. Oh, we're both correct. It could be anything. Or it could be resolved in a restrictive way. For whatever reason, you are right. Okay? There's only one meaning to this word. On the other hand, when we have the solutions, when we have a harmonious solution of the conflict, or even without conflict, you either get the semantics of cooperation, which is an expansive tendency, or you would get a semantics of authority, which would be a more restrictive dynamics. To conclude then, I would say that a socio-semantic perspective on meaning variability will have to go beyond the observation of variation as correlating with social factors. That's a minimal step we should take, and to a large extent it still needs to be taken. As Professor Christiansen pointed out in the previous talk, it's absolutely the case that lectal variation is still understudied. specifically in the field of semantics. But we can study it, but my suggestion here is that when we study it, we should also we should maybe try to go even one step further and not just look at the correlations between lectal structures and social factors, but also try to see how the social forces or the socio-semantic forces that I just pointed out determine the flexibility. We will have to identify the underlying forces that determine or restrict the variability. At the same time, we need to see that this is a very, very far goal. We can think of models that bring together these various things and these various aspects in the way in which I did today in this talk. But I think you will agree that what I can present here was very abstract and philosophical and was not really based on sound empirical investigations, not on the same type of materials that I used in the talk this morning.